Nobody knows who the other side is, but I do. You know who it is? Turkey. And he got it. And those people that went in are controlled by Turkey.
By these words, the President of the United States didn't just acknowledge the fall of Bashar al-Assad, he named its architect. In December 2024, a regime that had endured more than a decade of brutal civil war collapsed in less than 2 weeks. To many observers, it appeared sudden, but for those watching closely, this was not a spontaneous fall. It was the final stage of a long, calculated strategy. For years, the world viewed Syria primarily through a humanitarian lens, images of destruction, displacement, and blood. Turkey, however, saw something different. It saw a geopolitical chessboard. Step by step, it positioned itself not just as a participant in the conflict, but as a decisive architect shaping its outcome. Rather than direct confrontation, Ankara relied on a mix of calculated influence, strategic patience, and what some analysts describe as rebel engineering. It worked quietly to reshape the opposition, while simultaneously negotiating with global powers behind closed doors. The objective was never just to weaken Bashar al-Assad, but to control what came after him. One of the most critical tools in this strategy was the Astana process. On paper, it was a diplomatic initiative involving Turkey, Russia, and Iran aimed at de-escalation. In reality, it allowed Turkey to position itself as the indispensable intermediary. By convincing Moscow and Tehran that it could manage opposition forces, Ankara gained leverage over both its allies and its adversaries. Idlib, the last major opposition stronghold, became less of a resistance hub and more of a controlled pressure zone, one whose stability depended largely on Turkish decisions. But diplomacy alone did not bring down a regime. The real shift came through strategic trade-offs. In geopolitics, influence is rarely free, it is exchanged. Turkey understood this well by opening space for Russia to expand its presence in Libya. Ankara offered something of immense value. It is access to the Mediterranean and a stronger foothold near Europe's southern flank. This move complemented Russia's posture in Ukraine, effectively extending its reach across two critical fronts. In return, Turkey received something far more subtle but decisive. When the final offensive against Assad began in 2024, Russia did not intervene in the way it had for years. Its air force, once essential to the regime's survival, remained inactive. The absence of Russian support was not accidental. It was the result of a quiet agreement, one that changed the balance of power overnight. While these international arrangements unfolded, Turkey was also focused on a more delicate project, reshaping the identity of the opposition itself. It recognized that fragmented militant groups could topple a government, but could not build one. For that, a transformation was necessary. Through intelligence channels and sustained engagement, Ankara encouraged key figures within the opposition to evolve. Among them was Abu Mohammad Al-Jolani, a figure long associated with jihadist networks. Over time, under Turkish influence, he distanced himself from those affiliations. He adopted a new name, Ahmad Al-Sharaa, and began to present himself not as a militant commander, but as a political leader. This was not merely a rebranding exercise, it was part of a broader effort to construct a functioning alternative to the Assad regime. In Idlib, institutions began to take shape under what became known as the Salvation Government. Administrative systems were built, governance structures tested, and even military training was formalized using lessons drawn from conflicts across multiple regions. What emerged was not just an opposition force, but a prototype state, waiting for the right moment to expand. By the time the final campaign reached Damascus, the groundwork had already been laid. The fall of the regime was not followed by chaos, but by a transition that had been quietly prepared for years. Meanwhile, other regional players found themselves increasingly sidelined. Iran, which had invested heavily in sustaining Assad's rule, saw its influence erode rapidly. Its strategy depended on maintaining a land corridor through Iraq and Syria, into Lebanon, a vital link for supporting Hezbollah. But shifting dynamics on the ground, combined with sustained pressure from Israel, weaken this network. In a last attempt to reverse the tide, Iran reportedly moved to reinforce its position with a large convoy of allied fighters. The effort failed. The convoy was intercepted and destroyed before it could alter the battlefield. With that, Tehran's role in Syria diminished sharply, marking the end of its central influence in determining the country's future. Behind all these moves lay a deeper concern driving Turkish policy. For Ankara, the stakes were never confined to Syria alone. The possibility of a fragmented Syrian state, especially one that allowed for Kurdish autonomy in the north, posed a direct challenge to Turkey's internal stability. With millions of Kurds within its own borders, the emergence of a successful Kurdish entity next door was seen not just as a security threat, but as an ideological one. Ensuring that Syria remained unified under a friendly government was therefore not just a foreign policy objective, it was a domestic necessity. By shaping the outcome in Damascus, Turkey was also reinforcing its own territorial cohesion. However, the fall of Assad did not bring stability to the region. Instead, it triggered a new phase of competition. Israel, observing the rise of a Turkish-backed leadership in Syria, viewed the development with deep concern. From its perspective, the emergence of a new axis aligned with Ankara introduced fresh risks to the regional balance. Rather than wait, Israel acted decisively. As power shifted in Damascus, Israeli forces moved to secure strategic areas along the border, extending beyond previously agreed lines. At the same time, a large-scale air campaign targeted what remained of Syria's military infrastructure. Air defenses, naval assets, and key installations were systematically destroyed, ensuring that the new government would begin its existence with severely limited military capabilities. Israel's approach went further. By engaging with minority groups in southern Syria, particularly the Druze community, it sought to encourage localized autonomy. This strategy aimed to create a buffer of semi-independent regions, effectively preventing the re-emergence of a strong, centralized Syrian state. The result is a Syria that remains contested, not through a single war, but through overlapping strategies. On one side, Turkey works to consolidate influence and maintain unity under its preferred order. On the other, Israel seeks to fragment and contain that very structure. What emerges from this complex picture is a reality that challenges conventional narratives. The fall of Assad was not simply the result of internal weakness or external pressure. It was the culmination of years of deliberate planning, negotiation, and adaptation by multiple actors. In the end, the map of the Middle East was not just redrawn, it was reshaped through a series of calculated moves, quiet agreements, and strategic transformations. And at the center of it all lies a simple but powerful idea. In modern geopolitics, outcomes are rarely accidental. They are engineered. In the heart of the Syrian chaos, and from the womb of the world's most extremist organizations, a man rose who not only changed his surname, but also decided to change the course of history in his country, from Abu Mohammad Al-Jolani, wanted internationally, and whose head carried a $10 million U.S. bounty, to Ahmad Al-Sharaa, who today sits at the helm of power. Is this a miracle of political transformation? Or is it the greatest cosmetic surgery for an ideology that has not changed in its essence? This wasn't a random coup. It was a masterclass in pragmatism, backed by regional superpowers and a transformation so calculated it left even the CIA stunned. Today, we delve into the pragmatic mind of Ahmad Al-Sharaa, between the legacy of extremism and the demands of statehood. Long before he was Al-Jolani, he was Ahmad Al-Sharaa, born in the Golan Heights but raised in the middle-class neighborhoods of Damascus. His father was an economist. His life was ordinary. But the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq changed everything. Like thousands of young Arab men, Sharaa was radicalized by the images coming out of Baghdad. He didn't just watch, he went. In Iraq, he He didn't just join the insurgency, he climbed the ranks of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He became a protege of Abu Mohammad al-Zarqawi, the most feared man in the region. He was eventually, in 2006, captured by the Americans and sent to Camp Bucca. Camp Bucca is often called the University of Jihad. It was here, behind barbed wire, that Sharaa met the men who would later form ISIS and the future leadership of the Syrian revolution. When he was released, he wasn't just a fighter, he was a strategist. But why was he released? Years later, former U.S. Ambassador Robert Ford made a startling revelation. Ford noted that during his time, the U.S. and Iraqi authorities were reviewing thousands of detainees. Sharaa, using the pseudonym Amjad Mudaffar, managed to convince his captors he was a low-level threat. He was released in March 2011, just as the Syrian revolution began. 2011. The Arab Spring hit Syria. As the country slides into civil war, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, then leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, sees an opportunity. He sends his most capable lieutenant back to his homeland to start a cell. That man was Ahmad Al-Sharaa. He crossed the border with a group of men and a small amount of cash. His mission, create Jabhat al-Nusra. Al-Nusra was different. While others were disorganized, Sharaa's group was disciplined, elite, and terrifyingly effective. But they had a secret. They were the official branch of Al-Qaeda in Syria. For years, Sharaa kept his face hidden, earning him the nickname the Ghost. 2013 brought a turning point. Baghdadi tried to forcibly merge al-Nusra into ISIS. Most expected Sharaa to obey his boss. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He defied Baghdadi. He publicly renewed his oath to Al-Qaeda's central leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, but the seed of independence was sown. He realized that to survive in Syria, he couldn't just be a global terrorist. He had to be a Syrian player. In 2015, his forces took Idlib city. This wasn't just another conquest. It was the moment Sharaa realized that holding territory required more than suicide bombers. It required a government. Then began the great pivot. First, he announced al-Nusra was breaking ties with Al-Qaeda. He changed the group's name to Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, then eventually Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. After breaking with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Sharaa retreated to Idlib. While the world saw a terrorist enclave, Sharaa was building a state-in-waiting. He became a student of governance. He established a tax system, paved roads, and, most importantly, started a charm offensive with the West. He began protecting Christian minorities and cracking down on the very ISIS cells he once helped build. He began a brutal campaign to consolidate power in Idlib. He crushed rival extremist groups and even arrested former Al-Qaeda allies. He was clearing the stage for a new act. He traded the black flag for a new green and white one. He traded the mask for a shaved beard and a suit. He established the Salvation Government. Suddenly, the man who once fought for a global caliphate was talking about Syrian national interests. He was no longer hiding his face because he realized his face was his greatest political asset. He was telling the world, I am the only one who can provide stability. November 2024. The world was looking at Gaza and Ukraine. But in northwest Syria, a storm was brewing. This was Operation Rada Al-Adwan, deterrence of aggression. This wasn't a rebel ragtag operation. It was a professional military blitz. And the engineer behind the curtain? Turkey. Turkey provided the diplomatic shield and the tactical blueprint. Through the Astana process, Ankara performed a geopolitical miracle. They convinced Russia to stay neutral. With Moscow distracted by Ukraine, Turkey argued that the Assad regime was no longer a viable partner. Simultaneously, they pressured Iran to pull back its militias, effectively isolating Bashar al-Assad. Sharaa's forces moved with terrifying speed. In 1 week, cities that had resisted for 13 years fell in hours. Was Washington caught off guard? Not exactly. Reports suggest that the U.S. was well aware of Sharaa's preparations. Behind the scenes, the narrative had shifted. The U.S. realized that Sharaa, despite his past, had effectively de-radicalized his organization to a nationalist level.
And people said he's had a rough past. We've all had rough pasts. But he has had a rough past, and I think, frankly, if you didn't have a rough past, you wouldn't have a chance.
As long as he promised to fight ISIS and keep the border secure, the West was willing to let the ghost become the president. Is Ahmad Al-Sharaa hiding his real face? Physically, no. His face is on every news screen. But ideologically, that is the billion-dollar question. He is the man who outplayed Al-Qaeda, outlasted ISIS, and outmaneuvered the Assad dynasty. He proved that in the Middle East, the most dangerous weapon isn't a suicide vest, it's a seat at the table and a willing sponsor. Ahmad Al-Sharaa has completed his transformation. The jihadist is dead, the president is born. But for the people of Syria, the true test of his pragmatism has only just begun. By the winter of 2024, the world watched in stunned silence as the Assad dynasty, a regime that had survived 13 years of fire and over 650,000 deaths, finally turned to ash. A lightning offensive by Turkish-backed HTS rebels did what a decade of diplomacy could not. It shattered the status quo. But this was not the end of the violence. It was the birth of a terrifying new shadow war. Today, two former allies, Turkey and Israel, stand on the precipice of a direct military confrontation over the remains of the Syrian state. For Turkey, the fall of Damascus was a masterstroke of long-term strategy. For 13 years, Syria had been a wound that would not heal, saddling Turkey with 3 million refugees and a growing threat of Kurdish separatism on its very doorstep. Ankara's vision was clear: a reborn, centralized Syria under their sphere of influence that would allow them to relocate millions of weary people and finally crush the PKK insurgency once and for all. The momentum seemed unstoppable when, in May 2025, the PKK announced it would dissolve its armed struggle, handing President Erdogan a historic triumph as he eyes an unprecedented fourth term. But as the Turkish crescent rose over the Syrian capital, a cold dread took hold in Tel Aviv. While the fall of Assad crippled the Iranian land bridge to Hezbollah, a massive victory for Israel, it replaced a known enemy with a volatile unknown. The new Syrian leader, Ahmad Al-Sharaa, may speak of moderate reforms and even formal recognition of Israel, but the Israeli security establishment sees only a wolf in sheep's clothing. Haunted by the October 7th lesson, where they once viewed Hamas as a pragmatist they could work with, Israel has abandoned the hope of diplomacy for a doctrine of absolute security. They refuse to believe a former Al-Qaeda affiliate has truly changed its spots. To prevent a new jihadist threat from taking root, Israel did not wait for the new government to settle. They carved out their own reality through steel and fire. The Israeli military launched a preemptive strike, seizing control of the UN buffer zone in the Golan Heights and launching a relentless bombing campaign that wiped out Syria's naval, air, and chemical assets. They issued a chilling ultimatum. Southern Syria is now a demilitarized zone enforced by the Israeli Air Force, with or without the new government's consent. The tension reached a terminal breaking point in September 2025, when Israeli jets struck a government complex in Doha, Qatar. Qatar is Turkey's greatest regional ally and a major non-NATO ally of the United States. By striking Hamas negotiators on Qatari soil, Israel sent a clear, brutal message to Ankara. Being a U.S. ally or a NATO member is no longer a shield. Turkey now fears that if Israel is bold enough to strike Doha, then Istanbul or Ankara could be next, especially as Turkey continues to host Hamas leadership. The two nations are now locked in a terminal, irreconcilable disagreement over how Syria should exist. Turkey demands a strong, unified neighbor to ensure the Kurds remain suppressed and the border remains sealed. But Israel views a strong, Islamist-leaning Syria as an existential threat. Israel's strategy is now one of balkanization, keeping Syria divided into ethnic and religious enclaves. This was proven in July 2025 when the HTS government attempted to crush a Druze uprising in the south. Israel seized the moment, declaring itself the protector of the Druze community across international borders. Israeli jets pounded Syrian government columns, forcing them to retreat and effectively granting the Druze de facto autonomy. By doing so, Israel didn't just save lives, they tore the map of Syria in two, incentivizing every other minority, the Alawites on the coast and the Kurds in the northeast, to resist central authority at all costs. This is Turkey's nightmare. If Syria remains fractured, the Kurdish proto-state remains alive, and the insurgency in Turkey will never end. Ankara is now cornered with few good options. They can launch a massive invasion to force unification, risking a bloodbath and Western sanctions, or they can turn to Russia, a fickle partner that has already shown it will stand aside when Israel starts bombing. As the United States prepares to withdraw its presence from the region, the buffer between these two powers is disappearing. No matter how you look at it, Turkey and Israel are no longer just rivals. They are heading toward a major confrontation that risks becoming the next great conflagration of the 21st century. This places Syria in a delicate balancing act between two powerful and opposing forces. Turkey seeks security and influence in the north, while Israel focuses on neutralizing threats in the south. The Syrian government must find a way to avoid direct conflict with both, while still maintaining its sovereignty and authority. This is not just a matter of politics, it is a matter of survival. To navigate this, several strategies may be essential, like adopting a form of diplomatic neutrality could help Syria position itself as a stabilizing force rather than a battleground. Or, building relationships with neutral or mediating countries could provide support and reduce isolation. And perhaps most importantly, the government must focus on internal strength, rebuilding the economy, restoring governance, and gaining legitimacy in the eyes of its people.